Welcome to Atheist Talk. I'm your host tonight, George Kane. There have been an unusual number of books about atheism that have reached the bestseller lists recently. Tonight, we're going to do some reviews of some of those books. My guests tonight are two members of the Minnesota Atheists Board of Directors. Cynthia Egley, our president, is going to be reviewing the book Letters to a Christian Nation by Sam Harris. I will be reviewing the book The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And our treasurer, Jack Caravella, will be reviewing the book Breaking the Spell by Daniel C. Dennett. So, Cynthia, why don't you start off? What do you want to tell us about the Letter to a Christian Nation?
Thank you, George. Letter to a Christian Nation is by Sam Harris, who earlier had written a book called The End of Faith. And so this book is a response to the responses he received on The End of Faith, because he got some very dramatic reaction to that book. So if there's only one book you can read among these three, I have to say you should read this one, because it's very short, it's very easy. And one of the things about Sam Harris is he's brilliant in his clarity, his simplicity, his brevity. I think he touches every major point, every major reason why atheists are atheists in this little book. And it was just really impressive the way he is able to say things in a way you've never heard them said before that make them so clear. He started out the book to let people know that he's writing this to a certain group of Christians. When he says Christian nation here, he's really talking about the more extremist Christians, because he knows there's a lot of more liberal people out there. And the thing is, he got these reactions from people who were pretty fundamentalist. And he points out that these people claim that this is one of the best things that ever happened to them when they found Jesus, and that it gives them, this sense of great love. They've been transformed by Christ's love. And he says, but they are deeply, even murderously intolerant of criticism. And he says, well, we might want to ascribe this to human nature, but it seems to be mostly from the Bible. It really gets support from the Bible. And he says, how do I know this? The most disturbed of my correspondents always cite chapter and verse. I think any of us who've been atheists for a while and known other atheists who've been in the public eye are familiar with this reaction, this tendency to get letters from people who cite all kinds of verses of the Bible for how badly we are going to be punished. But he just wanted to be very clear with this book. He says, in Letter to a Christian Nation, however, I engage Christianity at its most divisive, injurious, and retrograde. So we want to keep that in mind as we listen to this, because his comments are very strong. He's no shrinking violet. He says what he thinks very clearly. He points out that by one poll recently, it looks like a Gallup poll reveals that 53% of Americans are actually creationists, which means that more than half of our neighbors believe that the entire cosmos was created 6,000 years ago. This is, incidentally, I love this one, 1,000 years after the Sumerians invented glue. Those with the power to elect our congressman and our president, many who get themselves elected themselves, believe that dinosaurs lived 2 by 2 on Noah's Ark, that light from distant galaxies was created en route to the earth, and that the first members of our species were fashioned out of dirt and divine breath in a garden with a talking snake by the hand of an invisible God. Somehow, the way he says that, it just seems so clear. And it seems so ridiculous. Somehow I could almost understand those images. I grew up with some religious beliefs. But when he says it that way, it just seems very clear that it doesn't make sense. He talks also about how it is very clear that it's one way or the other. Either the Bible is an ordinary book, and it was written by mortals, and either Christ was divine or he was not. And if the Bible is an ordinary book, and if Christ was an ordinary man, then the whole basic doctrine of Christianity was false. And if it's false, you can't be building all this structure that we have built on it. He points out that for every devout Muslim, they have the same reasons for being a Muslim that that the Christians have for being Christians, but the Christians don't find their Muslims' reasons compelling, and why don't they lose any sleep over why not to convert to Islam? Can they prove that Allah is not the one true God? Can they prove that the angel Gabriel did not visit Muhammad in his cave? And of course they can't. But they don't feel the need to prove any of those things, to reject from their perspective that these notions in Islam are absurd. Well, but they keep saying to us as atheists that we have to prove to them rather than they to us that their beliefs make sense. So he points out things like this. He talks about the wisdom of the Bible. People think the Bible is so wise, but when it comes down to it, the Bible is so contradictory and so muddled that people can pull anything out of it that they want. They can believe anything. He said if you really wanted a good example of ethics, what you should look at perhaps is Jainism, because Jainism is very clear about ethics. There's nothing else in the writings of Jainism that would allow you to take any other perspective, but they believe in complete and total nonviolence. And so they're very much clearer than any of the Christian writings. So, he says there are certainly other options. The Bible isn't all that wise. He talks about the moral wisdom of the Bible. He says it's useful to consider a moral question that's been, everyone has solved this to their satisfaction, which is the question of slavery. It's pretty well agreed that slavery is wrong. I mean, we still have people practicing slavery, but we generally agree that it's wrong. If you look at the Bible's very clear that God expects us to have slaves. And it also makes it clear that men are certainly free to sell their daughters into slavery, no problem with that. And Jesus never objects to slavery. It's just fine. He tells them to serve their masters well. So nothing in Christian theology remedies the appalling deficiencies of the Bible on what is perhaps the greatest and easiest moral question our society has ever had to face, and that of whether we should have slavery or not. He also makes a comparison for the evolution creationism debate about how if we had people here worshiping Zeus, how would we feel if people were pouring tons of money into temples for Zeus and programs to help people believe in Zeus and things of that nature, and inhibiting research because the Iliad and the Odyssey don't talk about it and things like that? And on the evolutionary thing, if people decided that the sun was not a star, for example, not really a star, and started going out and campaigning against having the sun described as a star, and went to schools and explained how it really isn't a star and we should believe it, how much sense would that make to spend all that time trying to persuade people not to teach kids that it's a star and talking about how how evil astronomers are trying to bend our minds or something? It would be downright embarrassing because we're so clear about that knowledge. And what people don't get is that our knowledge of evolution is on that same scale. It is so clear that this kind of argument is as nonsensical as insisting that the Earth is flat and that it's the center of the universe and the sun goes around it and the sun is a fire, not a nuclear ongoing explosion or anyway. So it is just, he makes these excellent comparisons that just make things so clear. So I just really enjoyed reading this book, and if you can't read anything else, I strongly recommend it.
All right. Thank you, Cynthia. We were discussing these books before the program, and we noted that the New York Times has a list of bestsellers in the religion and ethics category, and that book has reached number 2. Well, number 1 for quite a while has been this book by Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. Oxford professor Richard Dawkins is perhaps the world's best-known atheist. He earned his reputation with earlier books such as The Blind Watchmaker, The Selfish Gene, and The Devil's Chaplain. In these earlier works, Dawkins laid out the intellectual justification for atheism. In this latest book, The God Delusion, Dawkins undertakes to convert readers who are straddling the fence, inclined to accept religion, even though they recognize that it has some problems. In The God Delusion, Dawkins sets out on the attack vigorously rebutting every argument for religion, then exposing the pernicious effects on society that religion has. It is the most resolute argument against religion that I've read, and it's a book that every atheist should have. Dawkins examines varieties of the God hypothesis and sets about to rebut every apologist's argument. He begins with Thomas Aquinas' proofs, followed by the ontological argument and other a priori arguments. Arguments from design, then arguments from personal experience, arguments from scripture, from authority, and finally Pascal's wager. It's a very useful reference to have rebuttals to so many of the most common arguments together in one book. Dawkins is clear and succinct, but as a college philosophy major, this was one chapter that I found a little disappointing. Dawkins dismisses the arguments for God brusquely, entertaining the casual reader. Unlike a philosopher, however, he accords them insufficient intellectual respect to look for nuance or to strive for thoroughness. The chapter that will attract the most immediate attention from most readers is entitled, "Why There Almost Certainly Is No God." Not surprisingly for a biology professor, Dawkins finds his answer in evolution. The mechanism of natural selection dispenses with any need for a designer, an insuperable problem for philosophers before Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species. In the time frame established by geology, there is plenty of time to account for the origin of life, even if that event is extremely unlikely. Natural selection then accounts for the entire job after that, creating all of the complexity of life, including the origin of intelligence. While evolution is perfectly suited to this task, Dawkins is sure that an omnipotent creator is not. He writes that, and I quote here, "Any God capable of designing a universe carefully and foresighfully tuned to lead our evolution must be an extremely complex and improbable entity who needs an even bigger explanation than the one he is supposed to provide." Thus, the God hypothesis is very close to being ruled out by the laws of probability. Dawkins applies the tool of evolution also to explain the development of culture, including the origin of religion. One might expect that Dawkins would be forced to acknowledge that religion, to have become so ubiquitous, must itself be valuable for promoting the survival of our species. But rather, Dawkins regards it as the misfiring of a useful meme. A meme is a concept that Dawkins originated in his earlier writings, a cultural idea or construct that replicates itself in imitation of the role of a gene in biology. The religious meme has been successful not in promoting the survival of our human species, but only in spreading itself. Dawkins equates religion to the phototropic blunder of a moth who flies too close to a flame. In most arguments with theists, atheists feel obliged, while sharply criticizing the errors of religion, to acknowledge its benign effect on society from ethical, education, and charitable work. But Dawkins decries the pernicious effects of religion, while dismissing it as unnecessary for its presumed benefits. The belief in God is, Dawkins shows, not at all needed to explain why people behave well, and therefore contribute to the benefit of society. Dawkins is obviously irked by the favorite argument of theists and that historic villains, such as Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, were atheists. He points out that it's not clear that Hitler ever escaped his childhood Catholic upbringing, and also that Stalin's schooling was in an Orthodox seminary. Most importantly, he argues, while Christians commit human rights atrocities because of their religious dictates, no one has ever done so in the name of atheism. While atheism cannot guarantee the restraint of national leaders from brutality, at least none would ever violate human rights because of atheism. The God Delusion is an indispensable toolkit for any atheist who wants to engage his God-believing friends in debate. It's a call to action for the timid atheist who otherwise just wants to be accepted by the nation, to be accepted by the believers in religion as reasonable, intellectually honest, and morally responsible. Despite our low numbers in the United States, Dawkins is sure that this is a battle that we can win. He disdains even well-known scientists such as Stephen Jay Gould for accommodationist positions such as non-overlapping magisteria. He compares such atheists with Neville Chamberlain making concessions to Hitler. So if you're undecided about whether or not there is a God, or if you want to arm yourself with arguments to use with your theist friends, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins is a book that you simply must have. Our final review tonight will be given by Jack Caravella, Minnesota Atheist Treasurer, which will be Breaking the Spell by Daniel C. Dennett. Jack?
Thank you, George. Breaking the Spell, subtitled Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, is by Daniel C. Dennett. He is a professor of philosophy and also the co-director for the Center of Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. He's also the author of many other books, the most famous being Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And the premise of Darwin's Dangerous Idea is relevant because it seeks to use evolutionary science to explain and to be used in other disciplines, for instance, anthropology and psychology. And not surprisingly, that's what he brings to religion in Breaking the Spell. He has a different approach than Dawkins or Harris in that he makes a concerted effort to try and bring the believer along with him and to try and get them to accept his arguments. Most importantly, he feels that we must study religion as a natural as opposed to a supernatural phenomenon, one that can be explored and explained scientifically. And he realizes that may offend some people who believe that their religion is given to them by God directly. But he proposes this question to those people: what about other religions? Where do they come from? Wouldn't you want to at least know that? And if your religion is so strong, then you really have nothing to fear from a philosopher like myself. So he wants to bring people along. He does have to kind of close the door to creationists, because since his explorations and arguments are based on evolution, anyone who thoroughly rejects evolution, he says, I'll have to bid you adieu. You won't get anything out of this book. But beyond that, he does make a sincere attempt to try and bring the believer along to examine his arguments. He himself is a philosopher, not a scientist, but he has a very strong interest in science and reviews other science that has been done on religion. And unfortunately, as he points out, there's been very little that has been done objectively. Only in the last few years have any researchers attempted to look at religion objectively. He, for instance, will not make any conclusions in this book as to whether religion is a good or a bad thing as a whole. Certainly there may be elements of both. What he's calling for is a strict exploration of it. And a lot of interesting ideas spring to mind as you read this book, particularly when he talks about evolution as it applies to different things in our lives, things that aren't necessarily biological. And he brings in Dawkins' meme to use in this discussion. For instance, he makes an interesting analogy between music and religion. And only recently have we started to discuss and explore music scientifically. Why does it give us pleasure, and what value do we hold in music? And he makes a comparison between early forms of music and early forms of religion. For instance, religion seems to be, in its most primitive states, a kind of folk religion, where a shaman, for instance, will attempt to heal someone by invoking some divine power. And in these religions, when anthropologists have studied them, they've sometimes been surprised to find that there's no very well worked out theology. They simply are trying to placate gods, make sure the crop comes in well by performing a sacrifice. And when asked, they really don't have a clear conception of what God looks like, what his temperament is, whether it's a he or a she necessarily. And then it starts to develop. And again, these are some theories that he sets out. He doesn't propose that any of these is established fact, but he makes some very good arguments and gives you a lot to think about. For instance, with folk music developing into more complicated forms, you could see these folk religions developing into more complicated forms with rituals and so forth. And the cause of religion, there are different ways to study that, and there have been a lot of theories about it, but Dennett's position is we can actually do some work and kind of get to these root causes and discover them. And he goes through a lot of the kind of quote-unquote common sense definitions or reasons for religion. Certainly transactions between deities to benefit people, to comfort them, to provide an afterlife, and so forth. But he wonders, as any scientist should, are these the only ideas that can be used to get this form of comfort? Why aren't others used? And how are they invoked for good and for bad? Certainly there's an evolutionary rationale for religion to allow people to congregate into groups and to protect each other, because naturally people have an affinity for their family members and will look out for them and cooperate with them. But how do you extend that to a larger group? And he proposes that perhaps the religion was invented to do that, that it was a way to bind people together. But there are many other reasons, and going back to evolution, you learn a lot of interesting things about how people have evolved to value certain things. As we said, music is still under close consideration, but simply things like sugar. In fact, there are two theories of religion that he points out in the book too, the sweet tooth theory and the symbiont theory. And I think George, in his discussion of Richard Dawkins' book, points out the symbiont theory, where religion may, in effect, have a life of its own. It isn't doing us any good necessarily. The sweet tooth theory is the idea that, like sugar, there are things we crave biologically, and perhaps religion gives us those things. And that's certainly worth exploring as well. What does it provide, and does it do a very good job of providing it to us? The other thing I would touch on is his idea of intentional stance. And this is an evolutionary trait by which any organism becomes sensitive to the things around it. Intentional stance for a clam, for instance, is at any sign of danger, any rustling in the sand around it, it'll pull in its foot and protect itself. Well, that's what he would call a good trick, evolution-wise, because it protects from predators. Now, when you go a little further, then it's a good idea to have beliefs and opinions about others and their beliefs and motives. And when you have all those things, you might develop some interesting ideas yourself, and you could tend to anthropomorphize things. As he says, anything that's complicated. We've even done this with our cars or computers, saying, well, why did you do that? I have to be nice to it. We don't believe that the cars or computers have their own minds, but when you believe that in a primitive fashion, you have all these imaginary agents, and why not put them to use to provide you comfort? So I would recommend Daniel Dennett's book very highly, Breaking the Spell. And again, I don't think it's going to be offensive even to believers unless you are a dyed-in-the-wool fundamentalist.
Well, thank you, Jack. It was curious that you say that Dennett tries to not make a judgment about the overall value of religion as to whether it's useful to humankind or not, whereas Dawkins is quite clear in his position that Dawkins believes that it's pernicious. He even refers to early childhood education in religion as a form of child abuse. I was interested, Cynthia, does Sam Harris take a clear position?
Oh, yes. Sam Harris's position is very clear that religion is destructive and that it's a terrible thing for children to be raised to believe that they are a Christian child or that they are a Muslim child. That how can a child possibly be any of those things just because they've been born in that family? He talks about a lot of the harm that it does. Like for missionaries, they do good work supposedly, but they can also do a lot of harm, like trying to talk people out of using condoms because they don't want them to have sex in an African village where people are dying of HIV. And really, it's fatal to be taking that. It's genocide to insist to these people that they should not use condoms. So he takes a pretty strong stance on that one.
Yeah. Jack, you said you had a couple of questions about the other books?
Yes. As I said, Dennett, although I want to make clear, Dennett professes himself as a non-believer. He prefers to call himself a bright who believes in the natural world and does not have any supernatural beliefs. And he does acknowledge as well that religion can be harmful and that those harmful elements, at the very least, have to be distilled and understood and hopefully abolished. But he doesn't want to pass judgment. Now with and he does that more with a scientific frame of mind, I think. He says we have to be sure about these things in order to say them clearly. But with Sam Harris, I've noticed he's come under some scrutiny from other atheists because he's talked in general terms using the word spirituality. And I know he did that in The End of Faith. I wondered if there was any mention of that in Letter to a Christian Nation.
Only very briefly at the end. He doesn't really get into that.
Okay. With Dawkins, on the other hand, Dawkins is quoted and is obviously a friend of Daniel Dennett's, so they have a lot in common. I wondered if Dawkins has any call to study religion or has just, because I've heard him say that he still gets a lot of benefit from religious music and art. Does he talk about that in The God Delusion?
That's not his focus in this book. Really, I think it's very stridently, clearly a stand against atheism. Excuse me, a stand against Christianity and against religion. We've come to the end tonight. I know the evening's gone by extremely fast. And we're Minnesota Atheists, and we hope that you'll check us out by going to our website, which you've seen up on the screen several times tonight. Please contact us. Please, if you do, we will put you on email distribution for our weekly calendar, and we'll send you one free issue of our newsletter. We'd love to hear from you. So if you're interested in us, we're interested in you.